which is going to be presented by distinguished Prof. Pierre DeVos. He did his LLB and LLM at Stellenbosch University. He also has a BCom from Stellis, and he went on to do another LLM at Columbia University in the US, and came back, no, not came back, but came to UWC for his LLD, when he also started his lecturing from 1993 to 2009, until he decided to go to closer to the mountain. He specializes in constitutional law, socio-economic rights, non-discrimination issues, and he is also a vivid writer. He has a blog, Constitutionally Speaking, but I'll hand over to him now for his presentation, which will be between proportionality and accountability.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, always nice to be back at UWC. How does this work? I have a dislocated finger from falling in Cuba, so I can't do it so well. I don't have a PowerPoint because I hate PowerPoint, but also because I don't really have a paper. I have thoughts, which I at least have written down. And what I'm supposed to talk about is about the electoral system and accountability. So hence the title, proportionality, between proportionality and accountability. The assumption being that there's a kind of trade-off, that if you have the kind of pure proportional representation system, or some version of proportional representation system, it is likely to diminish the accountability. If you have an electoral system that is more constituency-based, like a first-past-the-post system, it's going to enhance the accountability in some way. Okay, so I'm going to explore that a little bit and ask questions whether that assumption is true and how, what, if it's not true, what we do with this. But before that, maybe first ask what we mean by accountability. Why is it important? In the obvious sense, for the talk on electoral systems, one would think that it is the accountability of the elected representative to the voters, that there needs to be some sensitivity or some responsiveness from the elected representative to what the actual voters want, what they feel, and so forth. And that the assumption then that if you have a specific electoral system, the MPs, say, in the national parliament are going to be more responsive. They're going to be more alert. They're going to not necessarily follow the party line. They will follow their own conscience, if any, or whatever. And in that way, the kind of power of the voters will be enhanced. Accountability, there's also, of course, in the constitutional sphere, another kind of accountability, and that is the accountability of the executive to whomever. In the South African context, the executive is not really accountable to the voters. They are supposed to be accountable to the MPs, the elected representative. So only indirectly accountable. So one can also ask a question about the accountability of the president at the national sphere, or premiers at the provincial sphere, to the voters, whether we should not change the way in which the president or premiers are elected, so that that will also strengthen the accountability to the voters. So that is the context in which I'm talking. The premise, in a way, if there is a premise to my remarks, is that I'm a bit skeptical, and I've become more and more skeptical about the kind of discourse which assumes that there are quick fixes for systemic, cultural, political problems in a society. The idea that constitutional design tweaks can actually make a difference, or that it will make things better and not often worse. In South Africa, commentators and so on, every once in a while people will say, well, one of the main reasons why the system is not working, the parliamentary or constitutional democracy is not working, is because the electoral system, there is something wrong with it. And if we change it, it will change a lot, or it will improve matters. And I'm not so sure that those constitutional design tweaks is necessarily going to make the difference that people hope it would. Okay, so why do we have this system of proportional representation? Why, if it is true that it doesn't really lead, or it weakens accountability of the elected representative to the voters, why would it be there? When it was adopted, obviously the arguments were quite altruistically on the part of the ANC, although that might not be the full story, but the argument was that a proportional representation system is not only easy, it's simple, people understand it, it is a very fair system, because votes are almost directly translated into seats in Parliament. If you get 0.25% of the vote, you get one seat in the National Assembly. Actually, it's about 0.19% because of the formula that they use. Unlike, say, a constituency-based system where all the votes that are not cast for the winning candidate are wasted votes, a party can govern with a majority in Parliament in such a system if they have 35% of the vote, because they won the constituencies, and it completely skews the system. The second argument was that such a system is also good for representativity in terms of viewpoints, in terms of ideological spectrum, because it is so fair, it's going to allow for different, several parties to be represented in a legislature, not just 2 or 3, that is what often happens in a kind of first-past-the-post system. But it's also representative, much more representative in terms of gender, for example, and in diverse societies, race, and so forth, because if you have a first-past-the-post system that is sexist and racist or whatever, you're going to put up the candidate that is going to win the most votes. I haven't looked for the last parliament, but before 2019, South Africa was like third or so in its National Assembly for being gender representative. Iceland and Sweden or whatever, and Rwanda was before in front of us. So there are all those advantages. So the disadvantages, of course, is said to be that it is not, it weakens accountability, and it makes the elected representatives beholden to their political party and not to the voters. And it strengthens the position of the party leaders vis-a-vis individuals who are elected. Because in this system, proportional representation system, we vote for a party, not a person. Because the party leaders decide who is on the list and where on the list they are, your career as a politician, as a member of parliament, if you talk about the National Assembly, depends on you keeping the party leaders happy. It's a bit crudely put, but in essence, that is the case. Also, because of the provisions in the Constitution that you will lose your seat in Parliament if you stop being a member of a party, the party has a very strong power over you because if you don't toe the party line, you can be expelled and you lose your seat. So there is clearly that part of the equation is around us. We see it. It is not just a theoretical claim, but yes, I wonder to what extent this has to do with the electoral system, and to what extent it has to do with the party's culture, the political dynamics in the country, and so on. Because in the local government level, half the seats for each municipality is allocated in ward elections, where one person, candidates from different parties or independents stand, and then they get elected, and then they represent the party. I haven't seen any evidence that those elected representatives are more responsive to the needs of the voters, less beholden to party leaders than at the national or provincial level. Maybe there is some evidence for this, but it's not easy to see. And I would argue the reason, if I'm correct, the reason for that is because several, but at least because the party culture, the culture of party discipline is extremely strong in South Africa. Parties, including the three largest parties, have in their constitution provisions to enforce party discipline, whether you are elected via proportional representation list or as a ward councillor, and the power then in that sense is about more than just the electoral system. At least that's what I think. The other disadvantages of the proportional system, which I'm interested to hear what you think, what that says about accountability, is of course that if you have a proportional system, you're much more likely to get a fragmentation of political parties, because it's very easy to get elected, say, to the National Assembly. So instead of 2 or 3 parties, which you will get in a first-past-the-post system, in our parliament at the moment there are 12 parties. After the election it might be 15, or who knows how many parties will be presented. That fragmentation with parties with 1 or 2 or 3 seats in the National Assembly, the question is, does that further weaken accountability, especially if those parties don't really have a coherent ideological position? It is personality driven. Why does that make us think about the quality of at least the formal democracy that works through the legislature, the executive, and the interaction between them? I am not a fan of smaller parties, not as an absolute principle, but in the way that currently, given the context of South Africa, it plays out, because even more than the larger parties, the smaller parties with 2 or 3 representatives are opportunistic. We have seen at the local government level, what happens is that votes are traded for positions, or for influence, or for maybe bribes, who knows. Yes, bribes in Nelson Mandela Bay, there has been actually people facing prosecution for this. And so it seems that that there is that proliferation, which was supposed to be one of the advantages of the system, and variety of voices, somehow doesn't really work in practice, because the parties don't really, they stand for everything and nothing, the smaller parties. Of course, adding to that, maybe as a footnote, that supports my questions about making constitutional design tweaks so that to enhance or make the system better. Such a tweak really was introduced by the Constitutional Court in the UDM judgment, the second UDM judgment, in which it ruled that if National Assembly holds the President accountable, it is permissible to have, through a vote of no confidence or through impeachment, it's permissible to have a secret ballot. We now know that that secret ballot at the local level, because the cases may be wrongly been interpreted as requiring a secret ballot, it doesn't. It gives the Speaker of the legislature the right to give a secret ballot when appropriate. What it has done is it has made the local government much more unstable. It's much easier if there's a secret ballot for a party with 1 or 2 members, for those members to make a secret deal with other people in the legislature or in the council, and it makes it very unpredictable. Okay. So, where does that leave us then? Well, you know, I don't really know where that leaves us. There are few things on the table, proposals on the table to make the system better. After the Constitutional Court judgment ruling, quite strangely, given the text of the Constitution, that independent candidates must be allowed to stand for election at the national and provincial level as well. The electoral system was changed to allow for independent candidates to stand, but it was a very minor tweak, and it is quite unfair tweak because for many technical reasons, independent candidates can only vie for 200 of the 400 seats. So if for the 200 seats that independent candidates can vie for, you almost need double the amount of votes that political parties who vie for the 200 seats that independent candidates cannot vie for need to get elected to the National Assembly. Constitutional Court said late last year that this was completely irrational, again for technical reasons. But there are other options on the table that for electoral systems that maybe the argument is could actually make a difference. I think the independent candidates won't make a difference because nobody's going to get elected. Maybe Zaki Ahmad, but I don't think any other thing. If Jacob Zuma were allowed to stand and he stood as an independent, it was okay. So the one is, of course, to go back to go to a first past the post system, to create constituencies. Each party can put up a candidate, independents can stand, and that is the end of the matter. But then there is no proportionality. It will skew the outcome in ways that seems to be profoundly unfair and undemocratic, in the sense that a government could be formed, a majority government, not a coalition government, by a party who is supported by only 35% of the people who voted, which is only about half the people who are eligible to vote. So it's about 18% of eligible voters supports the party. So that's, I don't think that's on the table. In any case, the Constitution, provisions in section 47 is it, and elsewhere says that the electoral system in general must result in proportional representation. The other option is to have proportional representation, but to make the constituencies through the constituencies or that a party can vie for smaller. No, that doesn't make sense. Multi-member constituencies. In other words, instead of having the whole Western Cape as one constituency vying for their proportion of the 200 votes to the National Assembly that they can vie for, you create 10 or 20 constituencies. So there's a proportional system, but the area for which that proportional system applies is much smaller. So you would have you would have part of the western of Cape Town maybe with 8 members of parliament, 5, 6, 7, 8. They vote in a proportional representation system, still for a party, not for a person, and the end result is that the allocation of MPs is proportionate to the proportion of the vote each party got in that large constituency. So that would not probably in general end in proportional representation unless you have a top-up list. In other words, unless you allow for, say, 100 members of parliament to be elected via a national list, and you correct for improportionality that comes from having these smaller areas. Will that make a difference? The parties will still decide who's on the list. They will still, in the same way that they will decide who's their candidate if it was first past the post. So one of the questions that maybe you might want to help me to answer is, will the system be more accountable? Is the accountability really because the electoral system is faulty? Or is the problem much more systemic? Is it much larger? My feeling is that I'm not sure that even having a multi-member system, constituency system, or having the system we have at local government, where half the seats in a council are elected in wards individually, and the other half is a top-up proportional system, whether that, at this point in time, in the South African context, will make a difference. And that is perhaps because the political parties, the requirement for proportionality, for one, the requirement for proportionality, which always requires at some point a list, and also in our system at least, allows for the members of the party who are elected to lose their seats if they stop being a member of a party. All of those things, even if you will help to, or helps to weaken the link between the legislature and members of the legislature and voters. But I wonder if that's the only problem. I wonder what else is it within the political culture, within the dynamics, that makes it, maybe this is just a personal, very subjective observation, it seems very, I get very despondent when it looks like voters really don't count. And there is very little responsiveness in any context to the needs of the voters. The last thing I think I must almost done. The other question is a question that the Zondo Commission of Inquiry, Justice Zondo, he made a recommendation saying that one of the problems with accountability is that the President and the Executive is only accountable to the members of the legislature. Obviously, not only because of the electoral system, but maybe because of it, the majority of members of the National Assembly are really not very enthusiastic to hold the executive accountable because it's members of their own party, it's the leaders of their party, and as we have seen, their continued presence in the National Assembly depends on them keeping party leaders happy. So he recommended that the President should be separately elected directly by voters. The report, as in this instance as in other places, is really rather vague and weak. there's very little analysis. Why would it be better? Why would it enhance accountability? Why would it perhaps fix or make better other problems with the way in which the executive operate? And it is silent on the fact that the comparative constitution, in comparative constitutional law, the consensus or the majority position is in fact that having the direct elections of the president is bad for accountability and bad for democracy, often because the president directly elected has an independent power base. And the kind of accountability, especially in a system like ours where political parties are so powerful, that we do have are often to the party and not to the voters. And you will take that away if you have an independently elected president. So for example, the examples that could be used in South Africa is that both President Thabo Mbeki and President Jacob Zuma, when they were told that they have to resign by their party, the one more reluctantly than the other, but they both agreed because the party had a hold over them. In terms of the constitutional design, the party could have gone as far as have a vote of no confidence against them. And in that sense, that form of accountability, moderate as it is, via the elected representatives, the members of the party, did work, at least in those cases. If the president is completely separately elected, the argument is that the kind of moderating influences of the party as a whole is weakened. Maybe not always. If the president needs the president and the executive still needs the support of the legislature to pass legislation, but where the culture of the party is that in any case that the leader is sacrosanct as long as he remains the leader, and so forth, it is not clear at the very least that that system will be an improvement. I would say at the very least it is a bit disappointing that the Zondo Commission made this proposal without really providing any thoughtful justification for it, which is, and I will conclude there, for me an example of how people in the discourse, and often lawyers, especially constitutional lawyers, think there's a problem. If we only change this or that part of the constitutional design, it's going to fix the problem, and often it makes it, or has the potential to make it much
worse. Thank you very much, Prof, for the well-detailed paper and discussion. I do hope and believe that most of us have questions. As Prof mentioned that he also doesn't have straightforward answers to this, but just to quickly sum up on the discussion, I think he touched on the advantages and disadvantages of the current voting system, and also raised a few questions whether it would be a right move to then move to maybe a constituency-based approach, but also there are certain disadvantages in that. For instance, you have issues of how are you then going to divide the constituencies, because for instance, if whoever is in office at that moment can, or for instance, if Bellevue South is pro-DA, it's going to be divided into another side, and then you mix it up with ANC votes or whatever. But those are some of the issues that come with a constituency-based approach, and also the possibility of having to elect a president directly, but also looking at the current setup, is it a good thing to have electing a president, because at the moment South Africa votes for the party, and how do you then deal with issues where if you are taking a constituency-based approach and a member of the party is campaigning for their seat to be an MP for that, do they also put the same effort to campaign for the president? Because if you have noticed in some African countries, in most issues, in most cases, the presidential election is always contested, but not the constituency elections. But with that, I would open up the floor, and I know that there's a couple of questions that you want to engage with Prof. So yeah, I think the mic is roaming somewhere there.
Hi, thanks so much. So I've got a lot of questions, so I'll try and narrow it down. The one was, do you know if modelling has ever been done and to see what would happen if there was a constituency-based system? Me, for instance, I just off the top of my head would have thought in '94 that if there had been a constituency system, the ANC would have won an even larger majority. Yeah, so I was just curious about that. I wanted to ask, would that have, do you think that kind of model would have made sense? Then my next question was, could you say a little bit more about why secret ballots were allowed? Because the reason I'm asking this question is just, if we have a representative democracy and we elect representatives, surely we have the right to know what our representatives are doing. And I can understand that there may be conflicting issues there, but I'm asking as a non-legal scholar, why would legally that have come through? Then, is there a possibility that you could ever have an open list electoral PR system in South Africa? Is that just so complicated and never going to happen? I don't know. And then my last question is, Zimbabwe has great system on paper as far as I'm aware. It's kind of mixed PR constituency with the zebra lists and gender. And what's your view of that? Is that a model that you think would work, be replicated? I'm just, yeah, interested in when it looks so good on paper.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, from WC. Thanks for it. So I agree that the constituency system is problematic for the reasons that you mentioned, especially in terms of representation, including diverse views and communities. And also you are right that in a sense that at the local government level we have that electoral system, we don't see any better level of accountability. But I wonder, would it have made any difference if the constituency system at the local level would have been coupled with the power of recall, with voters having the power to remove the politicians? I know you're saying that any constitutional design, you're very suspicious of any tweaking having any effect, but I wonder. Thank you.
So just to add on the two questions, there's one that also is from Ms. Jenica. She says, hi Prof, in your opinion, what are the legitimate governmental purposes of the secret ballot in our legislatures? Secondly, also, which of the legitimate governmental purposes do you think are currently being achieved by a secret ballot?
Okay, thank you. I believe that the questions are not too difficult, but complicated nevertheless. Yes, so I have seen a model about, and I don't think 1994, but 1999, if there were constituencies, and it would have, the ANC would have gotten more than 80% of the seats in the National Assembly. Of course, that is what happened in Hungary, where the party won less than 50% of the vote and they got a 2/3 majority, and then they changed everything and completely collapsed the constitution democracy. Yes, so there is that problem. About the secret ballot, there was a technical argument in the judgment, so that's one way of looking at it, where the question was, the rules as they currently stand and the provisions in the Constitution as they currently are, does it prohibit the Speaker from allowing a secret ballot for votes of no confidence or impeachment? We do know that for the election of the president and the premier, it requires a secret ballot in terms of schedule whatever, but and the court said, well, we look here, it doesn't look like there's anything that prevents this. But then the Justice Mogoeng went further. It was quite an interesting judgment. It's more of wishing how things should be instead of how they are, by saying, despite the electoral system, despite the way in which everything works, members are elected, yes, on a list, to the National Assembly, we speak about that, but they represent they must represent the best interest of the country, and that sometimes would require them to make decisions that will anger the party leaders, the kind of argument I made now, especially if it's about votes of no confidence and so forth. And in those cases, a secret ballot would be appropriate to protect them and to ensure that they can follow their conscience, I always say, if any, instead of following the party line. Yes, so that was the formal reason. If I want to be naughty, I say the other reason that is not written in the judgment is that this case came about at the height of former President Jacob Zuma's shenanigans and unpopularity, and the court may have also been slightly influenced by wanting to create rules that could prod him out of the door. I don't have any evidence for that, but I think the politics there might be relevant. The open list, yes, an open list is where you have proportional representation, but the voters can decide what position they can rank the candidates in their preferences for candidates, so that you have the voters then seem to have more control over who actually ends up in the National Assembly, because they can manipulate the lists, or they can influence the list. I think it would be very difficult to have that system in South Africa because of its complexity, and because of issues with illiteracy. Yes, so it is understood that the system it's a complicated one. Maybe somebody has some suggestions of how it can be done despite the fact that it's complicated, but I don't think so. I don't really know the details of the Zimbabwean system, but of course it's once again, there's a complete disconnect between what it says on paper and what actually happens. A little bit like there's a disconnect, what it says on paper in South Africa, between the legislature holding the executive accountable and what happens in practice. Just changing it in that way, yes, I don't know enough, but of course I'm going to say that even then I'm a little bit skeptical. The power of recall is an interesting thing that I haven't thought about yet. So if you have if you have some, say half the National Assembly members elected in single-member constituencies, and you allow for the recall, it does, on paper again, will obviously give the voters of that constituency power over the MP. The other half of the MPs will of course be allocated from the national list, so they cannot be recalled. I wonder, I don't know how that will work, or whether it will work. It will obviously create then two tiers of members of the National Assembly, with the senior party leaders probably on the national list, so that their seats are safe. Yeah, what other consequences it would have, I don't know. But the bigger question is still one about the party culture, and whether all of the talk about electoral system is not really relevant, because the power doesn't lie with the institutions that we elect members of parliament or ward councillors or whatever to. I think that much of the power lies in the decisions that are made by the parties outside. It is not part of a democratic process. We sit in parliament, we discuss. There are elements of that, but there's a very strong extra-parliamentary emphasis. So the power in South Africa, unlike in some other democracies where the parliamentary members really have sway over what the decisions are of that elected body, in South Africa the party bosses outside tend to dictate. I mean, sometimes it's a good thing, like with the same-sex marriage bill, the ANC MP said, we're not going to vote for this, or many did, and then the chief whip and the chairperson of the ANC came and said, you better vote for this, or there will be big trouble, and then they toed the party line. So sometimes it's ambivalent. Sometimes it's a good thing and sometimes it's a bad thing. So I think I've answered all the questions.
We'll open another round for questions.
Thanks. Very interesting in terms of highlighting all of these contradictions and problems. One tries to fix something here and then 5 other things crop up there. But I was wondering what you think of this idea that I think has been suggested by some parties, that there should be a bottom minimum percentage, so that to address exactly this problem of the fragmentation of parties, which I don't think fragmentation is necessarily the hugest problem, but the opportunism has turned into a very destructive force. And I think that the MK party of Zuma is also founded with that in mind, But anyway, it'd be good to hear from you on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Pierre. I want to ask about the difference between wishing what were and interpreting what is, and how you sustain that distinction. How many of these questions about the internal workings of the electoral system do you think are truly constitutional questions that can be answered through the interpretation of the Constitution, as the court pretended in Doctors for Life, for example, which I think is also a problematic judgment, New Nation Movement, which is a problematic judgment, and the UDM judgment. There's a sense that some people wish to think that all of these questions are litigatable and constitutional, whereas my sense is that they're not. What do you think the future, the next 5 years or so, around litigation might produce in this regard?
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Mine is very quick. I think one of the reasons why the design is the way it is currently, in terms of the party having so much power, is because there were particular anxieties that informed the party and the formation of South Africa between the 80s and 1994. So if I can just ask maybe Prof to, if you can, maybe give us a sense of what anxieties do you think inform our party right now? Thank you.
Okay. I'll try and answer quickly. On the threshold, I am a big fan of the threshold. The smaller parties are not a big fan of me for not being a big fan of the threshold. So in other words, say at the National Assembly, to say that in order to, it's proportional, but in order to qualify for seats at all, you must get at least a minimum threshold percentage. In Germany, it's 5%, which is quite high. They wanted to make it 7, I think, but the German Constitutional Court invalidated that. 2%, say, for the National Assembly in South Africa, it will eliminate all but 4 or 5 parties based on the 2019 election. So the disadvantage is, of course, those voices are going missing. they won't be represented. The counter-argument is not a principled one. It's a pragmatic one based on the reality that parties, the smaller parties, even more so than the larger parties, are opportunistic, incoherent, prepared to make deals secretly based on consideration that has nothing to do with voters' interest. It will, I think, if you worry about stability of the government, if you worry about coalitions, and you worry about the way in which a party with one seat can hold the whole system to ransom, as happened in Johannesburg, where the mayor became, was it from COPE or from that other party? They have 2 seats in the, they have less than 1% of the votes, and they have a fundamental, or at least on paper, maybe they are told what to do and say, but they have a fundamental influence on the governance. So, once again, at the same time though, I am wondering what are the negative consequences that we haven't foreseen that is going to come in. We probably make it worse if we do, but yeah, for the moment I'm in favor. On the wishing, are these constitutional questions? Of course, there's a more broader problem of the judicialization of politics. So many conflicts and disputes that are in essence political conflicts, but has a legal aspect, end up in the Constitutional Court, partly, I think, because a feeling that the mechanisms created through the democracy to resolve and contest these disputes are completely empty, or mostly empty, because the decisions are taken elsewhere. Partly because one party was so dominant, and so there was the perception or belief, valid probably, is that the only way you're going to get what you want is to go to the court. The court, more and more in the Zuma years, accepted the challenge, so to speak, and ruled more and more in cases that where it didn't need to. It wasn't fun. They made a kind of strategic, in my view, political choice to try and minimize the effect of one-party dominance, of state capture, of all of those things. But of course, then they make decisions that turn out later on, when the circumstances change, to have been not very good decisions, like the public protector's powers are binding, because people were thinking about the incumbent public protector, and then when a new public protector came, and the powers are still binding, and now people don't like the new person, and some of the decisions are really odd and badly motivated, suddenly that decision of the Constitutional Court really looks dicey. So, yes. What will happen now? I sense, looking at the judgments over the past 2 or 3 years, there's been a pullback from the court. I don't know if they know what they want to do. And they're a little bit more circumspect about taking on robustly these kind of disputes that are framed in constitutional terms. But I haven't studied and checked every judgment in that regard. The anxieties now, political parties' anxieties. Well, obviously there's the anxiety of the governing party that they're going to lose power. I don't really know, and for me, maybe just as a citizen, I don't make a study of all the political parties, but as a citizen, it feels sometimes that, unlike in '94, political parties do not really believe in anything. The ideology and orientation and policy direction is a bit, with 1 or 2 exceptions, but even when there are strong stated policies, in a specific ideological direction, like the DA or the EFF, what happens in practice is it doesn't always cohere. So I feel it's difficult to see the political parties. They are a bit vague, they are a bit blurred. I don't know why that is, maybe somebody else, and maybe I'm wrong, but yeah, that's not really answering your question, but I don't know how to answer.
Do we still have one more? Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Pierre. As we did with the previous session, we're just going to roll slowly into our last sessions. And Tony, if you can come forward, and Henk, perhaps, if you want to go to the bathroom or grab another cup of coffee, you know, float around, but there's no formal tea time. Fixed break. Thank you, everybody.
No, for real, he's such a big friend. Side-eye. Mine is due on Monday, so I'm going to have to just be done with it by Monday, because I also want to involve certain research, because there's a sort of scholarship that we need to present. So yeah. Exactly, I'm with Polity right now, I know. I don't stay on campus, I'm in Houston now. I stay
But in 3 months delay, so from the day of the books of the national production, so 5 years from the day that the national yeah, they can't do it before the elections are before that day, unless the National Assembly dissolve and the provincial legislatures dissolve itself before. 3 months later. Like I don't know why they are calling.
Hi everyone, welcome to the third session. Thank you. Our speaker is Ntando Sindane. Ntando is at the University of the Western Cape. He's at the University of the Western Cape, which he joined recently. He's teaching public international law. Prior to that, he was at the University of the Free State. Prior to that, at UNISA. He has an interest in intellectual property law, as well as, I believe, critical legal theory. Yes, so the session is about democracy beyond representation. So whereas the previous 2 sessions still had some link with political parties, with systems of representation and so on, this session allows us to continue in a critical vein, but also to let our imaginations run wild, to criticize, to think differently, and to dream about alternatives. So, Ntando, we're looking forward.
Thank you very much, Hank, and good afternoon to everybody. So without wasting time, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, I just have 2 photos that will show on the screen. So most of what I will say I will be reading from my notes. The only reason why there's something behind me is because I'm going to use 2 photos. Now, the title or the topic that I will be speaking under is some decolonial notes about the honest and the ridiculous in South Africa's 30 years of democracy. And I've put together an abstract. It's the only thing I'm going to read, and then I will maybe begin with the discussion. The abstract is South Africa's democracy turning 30 years old gives us a fair opportunity to substantively reflect on the democratic project, both the concrete and the imagined. Where democracy is concerned, the usual focus is on the spirit, tenor, and the ambit of the Constitution. In particular, the essence of how power is constituted and how the reach of the state is curtailed. All of this is derived, of course, from a democratic mandate that the head of state and the executive garner from a popular vote. In this paper, I invite a discussion for us to think beyond these corners of what democracy is and its presently accepted markers. To tease out this discussion, I rely on some aspects of decolonial critical legal theory to reflect about the honest and the ridiculous that defines South Africa's democratic project in the afterlife of apartheid. By honest and ridiculous, I attempt to seek out the actual sentiment on the ground, the very gravamen of what people think/feel about where the country was, where it is, and where it should go. Finally, I argue that it is from the honest and ridiculous that we could be able to realistically grapple with the unresolved crisis of coloniality in all its manifestations. Now, I thought I would begin with reading an excerpt from Angie Kropp's book, The Country of My Skull, but having read the abstract, I'm not going to read anything else, I'm just going to paraphrase it. Now, in writing about the TRC, in the first parts of the book, she just recalls days before the TRC. And then, of course, she interviews Archbishop Desmond Tutu before the first day of the hearing. And she asks Desmond Tutu, may his soul rest in peace, she asks him, how do you feel? And Desmond Tutu says, I'm very nervous. But I'm nervous about the silly things, about the microphone not working. But I'm also nervous about the terrible things that might happen, like violence and stuff like that. So the key words that I want you to think about in what Archbishop Desmond Tutu said there is the silly and the terrible. Now, contemporary decolonial critical legal scholars have sufficiently problematized South Africa's condition. So I won't get in what they have said. I assume that everyone is familiar with this. I call them decolonial critical legal scholars. I put them in that bracket, but they call themselves different things. Others call themselves decolonial scholars. Others come from the Africana existential tradition. Others come from the black radical tradition. So it is myself who calls them decolonial critical legal scholars. And maybe if I recount what 4 of them say, for example, Dumiso Dladla, who focuses on colonial historiography, and who says that the problems that we have in South Africa is because our reading of our history is steeped in colonial knowing. This also appears in our iconography, in how we think of ourselves, how we name our cities, our towns, our children. Then, of course, there's somebody whom I should have started with, Robert Bernard Ramose, who then focuses on conquest and the made for what he then calls a post-conquest constitution. His critique of the constitution is that, for the lack of a better word, it is nonsense and we need to get rid of it. That is Professor Ramos. Then of course there's Joel Modere, who speaks about the need to talk about the afterlife instead of the aftermath of apartheid. So he says that the problem is that we have an afterlife of apartheid and an unending episode of racism. So if you read Modere closely, he says that the air that we breathe is racist. When you wake up in the morning, you make yourself a cup of tea. The kettle that you're boiling and the cup itself is an embodiment of racism. And then of course there's Mahlingozi, who says that the current constitutional design, the current reality, is based on elite pacts and is thus not representative of the people's genuine interests. Now, having read, this is not an exhaustive list, there are other decolonial scholars, especially within the law faculties or law thinking in South Africa. But primarily, I think the thrust of decolonial critical legal scholarship is twofold, as I understand it. One, the urgency to completely rethink our society, including the law and its relationship with society. And then two, the need to engage in a project to complete the incomplete business of achieving substantive freedom for all colonized and oppressed people of South Africa. And one of the speakers earlier said that whenever they ask people about democracy, people say freedom. Now, as it will be evidenced in this paper, I argue, it's a very dangerous thing to say, I argue, it's nice to refer to what others are saying, that what the democratic project is concerned, we might make strides if we focus our collective energies in seeking to understand the honest and the ridiculous. A decolonial perception of democracy is one that embraces what I call a radical honesty. Radical honesty is about addressing the proverbial elephant in the room. And the room in this context is not this room, but the room called South Africa. Now, I say that the essence of the honest and the ridiculous can be gleaned directly and indirectly from the people. Now, placing a differentiation between politics with the capital P and politics with the small p, which is a differentiation that I don't really like using but is applicable for the argument I'm about to make. I argue that in some part of partisan politics, we are able to learn what the voices of the people are. And we are also able to learn what political parties are saying is actually a desire to mirror what they think people want. So, to sample with this argument, I limit myself then to two examples. One representing the old, that is sometimes not so old, and one that represents the new. And with each, I ask the questions. Is this honest or is it ridiculous? And if it is ridiculous, how ridiculous is it? So I'm going to show you two photos now. I'm going to show you two photos. I'm going to analyze the first one, analyze the second one. I'm going to show you, take you through the first and the second one, then give you a brief analysis and then conclude. Now, in the first photo, which I hope you can see from the back, it's a poster pamphlet where the EFF in the Western Cape is inviting its members, that it calls ground forces, to a public hearing that is organized by the Western Cape provincial legislature to discuss the provincial powers bill. Now, I don't get into the merits of the bill. I have studied them, very interesting, but for the purpose of this discussion, I don't get into the merits of the bill. Instead, I draw my attention to the wording of the poster. I don't know if you can see from here, but just below the words public hearings, in black, there's a sentence there that I want to read to you. It says, the DA-led government in cahoots with ultra-racist right-wingers want to pass a Western Cape Provincial Powers Bill to lay grounds for the creation of an apartheid state. So you may not read it from there, but it's on the poster. The EFF is thus suggesting that the implications of the present debates on the bill may lead to the creation of an apartheid state in South Africa and return us to racist, undemocratic white minority rule. Now, the question then that I ask, is this honest? In the sense that, does the EFF honestly think that there is a realistic possibility that an outcome that does not favor their opinion may lead to the creation of an apartheid state? And if it is not honest, is it ridiculous? And how ridiculous is it? Second photo. The second photo, of course, I must say as a caveat, I can't verify its authenticity. It's a very old photo. I'm sure you can see. I don't know if you know the guy in the middle, but it appears to be an elections poster of the now dead National Party, which is of course the party of apartheid, whiteness, colonial crimes, and racism. Now, unlike the first elections poster, the words here are very clear and bold. Fight for your right to be white. The image fight is obviously ironical in the context of this paper, because EFF is a party whose name is Economic Freedom Fighters. And of course its members refer to themselves as Fighter XYZ, so Fighter Pierre, or Fighter Hen, or Fighter Versailles, in place of Comrade Pierre, or Comrade Hen, or Comrade Versailles, so it's Fighter. And more ironically, the image fight remains a common theme and feature in the sloganeering of various other political parties in the post-apartheid era. One example is the phrase "Frans Plus" with their famous slogan "Slantrag." Simple yet very loaded. Loosely translated, it means, for those of you who don't know Afrikaans, I'm from the Free State, so I know Afrikaans quite well. So Slantrag, loosely, means hit back. Verbosely translated, it means fight back. Now, the National Party, of course, did not put itself into power. It was voted for by the majority of South Africa, settler minority, who at the time monopolized the right to vote to themselves. Like the ANC, the National Party continued to be voted for, just like the ANC continues to be voted for today. Surely, this means that amongst other things, there must have been something about their messaging that appeals or appealed, I don't know if I must say it in the present or the past tense, appeals or appealed to the hearts and mind of white South Africans. Now this poster may be fake or part of the left-leaning fake news, left-leaning propaganda against the right wing. But the sentiment of fighting for something is vindicated by the present political party messaging. Now, I then ask about this photo. Is it an honest reflection of what some, in brackets, I put in brackets some, is it an honest reflection of what some white people felt then and what they perhaps feel now? Do they honestly feel the need that they must fight for their right to be white and for their culture? if this is not honest, is it ridiculous? And if it is ridiculous, how ridiculous is it? I just want to remove this photo. Now, my analysis. The story is not so easy. Like most things in South Africa, it is complicated. And what complicates it is that if any response says that the EFF is honest or that the National Party is honest, such a response would be off the mark. Because I find that in the case of South Africa, in the honest, there's a little bit of ridiculous. And in the ridiculous, there's a little bit of honest. And what do I mean by this? Whilst the idea of the Western Cape seeking to create, or the DA, the Western Cape seeking to create an apartheid state is somewhat ridiculous, it is underpinned by an honest anxiety. And fight up here, that's why I was asking about anxieties. An honest anxiety about South Africa being the most violently unequal society in the world, where such inequalities mirror the racial, class, and gender lines as designed by apartheid. As a result, the ridiculous is born from the honest, and the honest is born from the ridiculous. As a further result, we are then compelled to re-examine our perception of the ridiculous and realistically seek to understand as to how the ridiculous is indeed ridiculous. The same is applicable to the fight messaging of the National Party. What is the right to be white? If you think about it, the right to life, what is the right to be white? And is it something that is worth fighting for? I'm duty-bound to think about the debate about something similar. It may not have been coded in the language of political parties, the National Party, the EFF, or phrase France Plus, or as the right to be white, but it was certainly something similar when majority black judges debated with the minority white judges in the city of Tshwane versus AfriForum. The bone of contention, amongst many other things, was the place of white people and white culture, brackets Afrikaner culture, in post-1994 South Africa. The white judges in their studied opinion argued, and I'm paraphrasing them, in the actual paper, I will quote them word for word, but they argued that the majority had used broad strokes in describing apartheid and colonialism, and that there needed to be a more laden and nuanced view of issues when reflecting on some of these issues. Again, I do not want to enter the merits of this particular case, at least not for the purpose of this paper, neither to agree with the black judges or the white judges. Instead, I want to impress the point that even with white privilege and white supremacy as a mainstay in post-1994 arrangement, the fight for your right to be white is still a sentiment. Thus, there's some honesty when it is coined as slantreg, yet also the ridiculous for obvious reasons. In conclusion, in the actual paper I start with a sentence. In this paper I have demonstrated that a democracy beyond representation means listening attentively to the people and opening the conversation fully. So it's not always the technical sections, what the court said, what the court did not say, or what the manifesto of this party says and the manifesto of that party does not say. But it is about listening to the ridiculous and listening to it fully, and understanding that part of the ridiculous reflects the honest, and part of the honest reflects the ridiculous. It's my belief that one of the reasons why we are far from realizing Nelson Mandela's hopes and aspirations, in brackets, growth, reconciliation, and shared prosperity, or Oliver Tambo's dream as unpacked by Justice Albie Sachs, is in the fact that we're comfortable in optics of a superficial democracy, one that is within the confines of legality and the corners/parameters set out by the Constitution. This is by no means a critique of the Constitution, at least for today, but it is rather a labored bemoaning of a constitutional democracy that adheres to strictures of politics with a small p and cares about nothing much deeper or even the extra textual granularities that define the very political with a capital P arrangement. The decolonial term, partly presented by the Must Fall movement, hashtag Must Fall movement of 2016-2015, begs us, screaming to us, to go slightly bit deeper. It says we must be alert and attentive of the honest and the ridiculous, because both define our present and will most certainly shape our future. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fascinating, and I think that provides a very nice basis for exploring what you critique as superficial democracy, and perhaps along with that, some assumptions about what constitutes civil discourse and what constitutes valid contributions to democratic discourse. Right, the floor is open.
Thank you so much. If I may fight and done. You call us, we'll call you. No, thank you. I think that's, you go to a lot of seminars and people, tantalize your intellectual fancies, and then they don't publish the paper. So the first thing is that please complete it. Please do publish it. We'd like to engage. So if you look at the four intellectuals or the four purveyors of decolonial legal scholarship that you've mentioned, all of them I think have the interlocutor that is transformative constitutionalism. They're dealing with or they're working against this idea of transformative constitutionalism. And I want to ask you, what is your view on what the limits are of transformative constitutionalism, and is it any different from any of the four scholars that you've mentioned? And the second one is that it's one that lends itself to the whole debate around the limits of decolonial, or the decoloniality itself, of decolonial scholarship. And I want to ask whether, what is your response to, or how are you thinking about responding to a critique that decolonial scholarship, and if you look at particularly the scholars that you've mentioned, for instance, Joe Mudiri speaks about a radical decolonized future, and some people asking, what does that future look like? And of course, his responsibility is to provoke us and again ask these questions. So I want to ask you, how do you respond to the critique that parts of the decolonial scholarship does not attend to the economic relations of this decolonized future? Will the foundations, the structural foundations of a decolonized future be something that reworks capital, the logic of capital, or will it be something that imagines beyond the socio-economic relationships that currently obtain in South Africa? And then the one about the fight for the right to be white. And if I were to perhaps, let's say, reincarnate Biko and understand Black consciousness as Biko's thinking around trying to get Black people in those broad senses to have a particular consciousness to fight for, and the end destination is humanity. At some stage, Biko wants to even liberate people from the idea of being Black. He wants them to be human, so that they don't have to justify their existence in the world. And so do you think then, and what is your response perhaps to the question of, are Black people fighting for the right to be Black? And would you consider that to be ridiculous as well? And then finally, on the question around this whole idea that listening to concrete politics, to the people on the ground. I think that's a valuable thing that you bring. And what do you think is the value of multi-party politics, or how the contribution of multi-party systems to the erosion of us being able to listen when there's so many voices speaking at the same time? Thanks.
Yeah, I think, thank you for that question, for those questions. Is it Dr. Manjoli or is it Mr. Manjoli? I'll start with thank you so much for that engagement. Anecdotally, my boss is sitting in front of you, and we had a meeting, and my boss said that I'm expected to publish. If you don't publish, it's dereliction of duty. So we will try our best. I don't want to commit in a room full of people, but we'll try our best to get this published. Now, on multi-party democracy, and I think Prof slightly touched on this, both Pierre and Christy. Some people frown upon us having more parties than less parties. Some people say we have too many parties. I've heard your sentiment quite clearly. You don't like the smaller parties. Some people are even against these independent candidates. I take a somewhat different view. I think the more the merry, and what do I mean that the more the merry? In fact, it's very democratic to have more political parties. There are single issue parties, for example. We've had the Daha party, and we knew what they stood for. And for me, that is very important, that you need to have strong agitation, even if it's 2 people, it's 3 people, and let them be there, let them be at the table, let them be there at the negotiations. The fact that some of them are corrupt, some of them would want to become a mayor of the city of Johannesburg, even when they have less than 1% of the vote. It's unfortunate, but let's have, we don't have a party, for example, or that I know of, that uniquely focuses on gender issues, on the struggles of gendered people, the LGBTQIA+ community. In all the major parties, that matter is taken as an afterthought, So when the state is then constituted, you don't have that voice sitting at the table and saying, we are here for just this issue and nothing else. So I am very much for a multi-party democracy that emphasizes the multi. Now, the question on Biko and the question on whether are black people fighting for the right to be black, and I think you phrased it correctly. My understanding and your understanding of Biko is quite the same, that black people ought to fight for the right to be human, but as a precursor to that, then engages, or he teases the discussion with Hegelian dialectics to say the thesis of our existence is racism, which I think I agree is the proverbial elephant in the room called South Africa. And the antithesis, therefore, is strong black consciousness, where black people assert themselves primarily as black. But that is not the end goal. The end goal is a new face for humanity, where I think Biko is strongly influenced by Fanon, and that is the correct influence that I align myself to. So are black people fighting for the right to be black? The answer is yes, in the interim. But the longer goal is to fight for a new face of humanity. The second question that you ask is, what are the limits of decolonization or decolonial scholarship currently? Is what I think Prof. Christy mentioned in slightly. Some, and I don't want to slander my colleagues, but some radical decolonial critical scholars behave like political elites, and want to limit their scholarship to scholarship, and nothing much else. So they don't have a view about how the city of Johannesburg is constituted, because that view is not within the ambit and the purview of their scholarship. So the shortcomings of decolonial critical scholarship is that the sectarian sort of thinking about some of these issues is a weakness. Another weakness also is how we sometimes tend to bow to theory. It's a weakness that I point a finger at myself to say. Sometimes we think that for us to decolonize, it is compulsory for us to begin with Lacan, Marx, others, and to prove our point, it must then make that theoretical sense. This neglects other ways of knowing, stories, poetry, the ridiculous and the honest, that is sometimes reflected in statements such as the fight for your right to be white. So those are some of the limits that is still within that disciplinary decadence which it claims to be fighting out of. The first question is difficult on transformative constitutionalism, and where I differ with in particular the four scholars that I mentioned, but tentatively I might change my views 10 years from now. Tentatively, intellectually, I'm much more closer to the Malingo's argument, which is not a rejection of constitutionalism per se. So I'm a bit far from Ramosen, whom I appreciate for other intellectual interventions, closer to Malingo's in the sense that I do believe that fundamentally there was a problem in how we constituted ourselves in the early 90s. So, whereas the Constitution means how do we constitute power and curtail the reach of the state, Malingo's says Constitution in its very etymological sense is how do a people come together. And the people did not come together in 1994. We're in a rush to vote, to have one man, one vote, but we did not come together. That's why we are not a people, we are not one, because we did not come together. In short, we did not exercise the racist demons that defined us before 1994. So I am much, much more closer to him in that sense. And I am warm to the progressive capabilities of a deepened understanding of transformative constitutionalism. Pause there.
Thanks for that. Yes, so I'm really drawn to the attentive listening part. But I'm wondering now, I'm trying to think it through in what it would take. How could we create spaces, systems, whatever, where this becomes possible? And if we think about party, I mean, maybe one starts by saying that democracy is not only about party politics, obviously not, but within the party politics arena, which is based on the assumptions that parties are vying for votes in a free market, this kind of quality of engagement and it seems quite difficult, impossible maybe, I don't know. Yes, so I'm not really making sense, but I'm trying to think beyond. How will it look like? How can we imagine a space where politics could include attentive listening? At the moment, it's not easy.
Thanks, yeah, that's, I found that also interesting, and I must say I'm also drawn to the question of attentive listening, because I think there's not much of that happening in South Africa, or at this point in time actually anywhere in the world. I'm sort of wondering if you've looked into scholarship on humor and laughter and so on, because your idea, I like this idea of honesty versus ridiculousness, and how these things can actually shift positions. Because that picture with Verwoerd, I want to say the Klerk, with Verwoerd, I saw it as well on, I think on Facebook, and my sense was that it is a kind of a recreation with Verwoerd and you know, bringing in the National Party and so on. But it actually does put its finger on a kind of a what we've written about in a handbook on whiteness studies. It puts its finger on the kind of a defensive whiteness that's sort of burgeoning across the globe at the moment, which is fighting for its right to be white. Yeah. So it's very much, but it's I read it as a kind of yeah, on a kind of through the ridiculous stating. Actually critiquing something that is very real, also in relation, and of course it takes different forms, because if we look at it, you know, there's the AfriForum version, and then there's the Helen Zille version of that same thing, there's the Trump version, and so forth. But yeah, so I don't know if this is much a question or more of a comment, but yeah, I enjoyed that. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, just listening to the brother speaking behind me, an idea just came to mind that the ideas or the concepts of whiteness and blackness, are they not themselves constructs of colonization and imperialism? Because before colonization and imperialism, people did not identify within these two broad categories. It's either you identified according to your nationality or your ethnicity. So if we're saying we are decolonizing, yet we are using categories that come from colonization to identify ourselves, is that really decolonization? So would you agree with me if I say whiteness, blackness as ideas of identity are colonial themselves? Therefore, we are not decolonizing if we still identify with them, because they came as a result of colonization. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you. I'll begin with you. I'm not Prof yet.
Sorry.
Yeah, look, I want to run through this quickly. I don't know how much time I have, Chair, but I'll begin there. So, there's a decolonial scholar called two, in fact, Walter Miolo and Ramon Crossfogel. And then Walter Miolo speaks about what he calls the colonial difference and the Atlantic imaginary. And when he responds to the questions of whiteness and blackness, he tells a very simple story that when the colonizers arrived in the 16th century, they did not begin by asking for tea or anything like that. They said, you cannot read and write an alphabet. You do not have a history. Therefore, you are black and you are not human. And that was the beginning, according to Walter Miolo, of what he calls colonial difference. Of course, other scholars then came in with dismemberment, othering, but that moment is where things begin to go wrong. So, to correct or to decolonize, you cannot then want to use figures or imaginations that are not there. So Biko and Fanon then say, of course we need to move beyond black and white. But for us to move beyond black and white, we need to address them. And they need to cancel each other out. So strong whiteness must be cancelled out by strong blackness. And when these two have cancelled each other out, we have a new face for humanity. So the long and short of it is in decolonial scholarship, we must talk about race. Something that is not imagined but exists. You know, maybe very quickly, one of the reasons why Mosima Emane left the DA says, if you don't see that I'm black, then you don't see me. You know, very powerful, in my view, it's the most powerful statement Mosima Emane has ever made. If you don't see that I'm black, don't see me. Because I am black. If you don't see my blackness, it's worse than being colonized, because then I'm invisible. Now, Prof, on humor, laughter, and the scholarship, something that I'm reading currently. I'm thinking about the last 12 months. I've been thinking about generosity, and generosity is a constitutive element in our law. And so I read a bit about that, and I find it very interesting. The more I read about that, the more I am accused by some of my students of thinking outside of the law. It's an accusation that I embrace, but it is scholarship that I'm attentive to. And I agree with you that that's why I deliberately took that photo, Andrew Fairford, as an old photo, to demonstrate how the old is manifesting in the present. You know, Donald Trump, AfriForum, you know, and I argue, or I say, instead of, 5 years ago I would have said, racists, ignore them. Racists, ignore them. And now I argue, let's listen to this ridiculous sentiment attentively, because something there gives rise to it. You, of course, in your scholarship would know much, much more about this than I do, but it is something that I am thinking about quite intently. Which brings me to your question, Prof, to say, how do we then create a space for some of these things to be possible? And I've been saying it even in the Free State where I come from. It starts here. It's one of the worst things that are happening with the burgeoning rise of the far right is that academics don't listen to each other, academics don't tolerate each other. The moment you say you don't like small parties, and I like a small party, I stop listening to you completely. You know? So I think tentatively, again, this is just, it starts here. It starts with us listening to each other beyond our very silly corners of saying, I'm a labor lawyer, I'm an insurance lawyer, I'm in mercantile law, so these things don't apply to me. But also, in the communities themselves, I think during election season, we get lost to the spectacle and forget that in communities there are structures of social reproductions, there are structures that existed for over 100 years where people have conversations with each other. Inkundla, Horo, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Amabandla, Izingoma, initiation schools, you know. I know they have a very bad reputation in this part of the country, but in the Transvaal where I come from, those are spaces, for example, where when young boys go to initiation school, they are there for 2 months, you know. That's the space where we talk about these things, and we could deepen the discussions. So all I'm saying is that we must not wait for elections, because elections is a silly season. In elections, I'm very much likely to, as an example, to swear at Karen, whom I get along with under normal circumstances. It's a silly season. So the optics matter now, and the grandiose, the acting, the performative, the politics, the small p. But the politics with a capital P exist as a mainstay in our society. We just need to find those spaces, immerse ourselves, and talk to each other, talk at each other, talk over each other, as long as we are talking. But the emphasis is that it must start here. If we don't do it as academics, then how dare we expect the rest of society to do it? Thank you.
We have 2 minutes left. Any questions? Yes, there are 2.
Dante, thank you for that. I wonder whether we should start by debunking the term representative democracy. Representative suggests that there's something pre-political that needs to be represented or mirrored or reproduced in the political process. And it undermines this constitutive moment of discourse and deliberation that you refer to. So the whole idea, in some sense, of electing representatives was not initially to represent a pre-political interest, but to create a space for politics and discussion and deliberation to be possible within society. So maybe we should stop talking about representative democracy to create a space for these moments that you're talking about. It's just an idea, I think.
I think you've actually spoken about this, but since Christine invoked the friend-enemy relation earlier this morning, you know, and I think that's a real problem. So she said that there are strong boundaries being drawn, and of course by invoking friend-enemy, she's invoking Schmidt and Wolf and the work, and I wanted to bring it to our space, university space, and how do we work with it? And I was wondering whether you could make a link between your distinction between honest and ridiculous and the friend and enemy. And we see this. We see factions forming, and we see, instead of people having open discussions, friends and enemies forming. And how do we debunk it? Maybe by reading it through lenses of the honest and the ridiculous. I don't know. But I was wondering, I mean, if you know, Christy, I think evoking group saying democracy is fragile and something that we need to work on. How do we do it specifically in university spaces? And I think you started to respond to this, but maybe to elaborate. And I was wondering if Pierre or Christine might, just as ending, also want to jump in on that. But thanks, Nathan.
Yeah, I'm starting to feel like I've spoken a lot. Yeah, I think Vassal, yes, I agree that perhaps the representative was not meant to be as it is now. And maybe we need to move to the more constitutive, the more substantive, you know. But there's a danger also with shunning the representative, because, and we have a very good example, the bloodless revolution in Libya, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi does away with the representative, puts himself as the brother leader and says, we don't need these things of election, wasting our time and electing representatives. I will call an assembly whenever there's a national discussion, and my brothers as the brother leader. Correct, those of you in political sciences, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my reading of Muammar Gaddafi's great book. So it's my brothers, I will call you into the room. It's already gendered, brothers. I will call you into the room when there's a major national issue and we will discuss it. For the first few years, he did that. Until there was a voice in the room that said, yeah, but you can't be the leader for life. So the representative democracy in this instance allows us to vote in and vote out certain people. And is also stronger on the democratic more than the centralism. Because the centralism focuses on getting things done, moving forward, implementing, Rosa Luxemburg warns us about overly fixated on centralism. And I'm not one of those people who like democracy for the sake of democracy, but democracy for the sake of democracy sometimes protects us from the very worst that could happen. But the long and short of this vessel, I am closer to you in this sense. The strong boundaries, Karen, is I think this is something also that I think about, particularly in the university space, not just UWC. In my young career now, this is my third university, so I was at EFF before here. Then I spent close to 10 years at UNISA, so I'm now experiencing 3 universities. And one of the mistakes that we make is to think that it will not be painful. If we want to create or to fight, using Henry Ford's language, want to fight for safe spaces, democratic spaces, we must never think that breaking those boundaries is going to be like eating ice cream. It's going to be uncomfortable. The friendship, the theologians will call it the breaking of bread in order to break boundaries. That is very painful, because after the bread is broken, he is still betrayed. So the questions that then define the boundaries, the spaces, what do we do with them, the edge, the friendship, are not comfortable questions. And the mistake that we sometimes make in thinking about friendship, in thinking about boundaries, is that it will be comfortable. I think the more there's discomfort, the more we grow. Thank you.
Thank you. I was thinking while you were talking how the idea of the ridiculous and the honest could also be a key to understanding the delegitimation of liberal democratic politics amidst the cultural wars, as well as liberal universities, given the dismissiveness of those institutions to everything that does not fit into those frameworks. And I was also thinking about what you said about feast must fall and the need to go deeper, and how profoundly difficult it proves to be in our society to address the deeper underlying issues. Christy and Pierre, would you like to have a final word? Would you like to come in? Not? Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. I thought it was a very interesting session.
Thank you, everybody in person and those online. If you are still there, thank you for attending. I think it was a worthwhile morning. There's some further events coming up of Roki down the year. Karen is busy organizing a big conference on law and literature in July. And we're putting together a retrospective on the Sachs versus Rousseau judgment, which was decided in 1964, so it's exactly 60 years ago, with Justice R.B. Sachs, who was one of the litigants and in detention around that case, and how that case influenced or failed to influence the approaches to statutory interpretation later on. So that's going to be in April. Please keep a lookout for us, and we hope to see you here again. For those who are here and present, you're rewarded with lunch, so please join us for lunch afterwards. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.